Good evening, my friends. Welcome to Jmac Plays Some Games. I am Jmac. It is Wednesday night, Eastern Time. It is not Sunday, and that means I'm going to play a game that is not Hadean Lands. Hadean Lands Part 9 will happen this coming Sunday at 6 p.m. Eastern, but that is not now. Tonight, I'm going to play Harmonia by Liza Daly, a game that you yourself can play at harmonia-game.com. This is something new in the 2 months and change that I've been doing the stream. This is a hypertext. This is a work of hypertext interactive fiction, also known as choice-based, as opposed to the parser-based games that we've been playing so far. I expect this to be a different experience, and I expect it to be a very good experience, for lack of a better. And I have receipts because this game won third place in IFComp, the Annual Interactive Fiction Competition 2017 edition. This is a competition where non-parser-based games typically have a tough row to hoe to get into the top echelon. That definitely speaks to the quality of this particular work. Something I didn't know until putting the slide together just now is that this game has a place in the 2019 edition of, according to the ifdb.org, the Interactive Fiction Database, the top 50 IF games of all time. Somewhere around in the 30s, I think. That's amazing. So how do I plan to read this? Normally when I'm playing parser IF, I just read what's in front of me, and that's it. This game is going to be a little different, as we shall soon see. This is a web-based game that was built using a hypertext engine called Windrift of Liza Daly's own invention, and it has some visual effects that will become obvious once we get started. I don't intend to be, for our accessibility fans in the audience, I don't intend to be completely Y area compliant and announce every time something new appears on the screen and tell you where it is. I'm just going to read text as it appears, and if something surprising happens, I reserve the right to comment on that. Otherwise, I'm just going to read. And a hypertext game versus a parser game tends to have a lot more flow and a lot more forward momentum. I do not expect a puzzle fest here. I do expect that we may need to make some choices, and I do wish to reflect on those choices, and perhaps I will think out loud about the process of my own reflection. But I'm not going to stop and take requests or throw out a lifeline to the chat or whatever. I'm just going to play this game. I have not played this game. And on that note, one of the things I do know about this game is its subject matter, which is about a scholar, I believe in the late 20th century. I did play the first couple pages, so I know that much, who's doing research on a bygone American 19th century fictional, I do believe, feminist utopian society. As such, I expect not just that the game will have primarily women's voices in it, but that its subject matter will be about feminism and womanhood. And as such, before I did this, just to acknowledge the elephant in the room, I did ask Liza, hey, would it be okay if a dude reading by himself did a public performance of this particular work? And she said, yeah, go for it. So that is my acknowledgement of that. And without further ado, I would like to, and she did add, and I look forward to seeing how this turns out, that this would be an excellent opportunity for me to add a stuffy 19th century male academic into my voice acting repertoire. I don't know if she means whether that a character fitting that description appears in the game, or if she's suggesting I read the entire work in that voice. Like I said, I'm just going to read it, and I'm going to read it with all due respect and mindfulness, and we'll see what happens. I already can tell you there's some names in the game I don't know how to pronounce, and I'm just going to do my best, just like with Hadean Lands, which has an international cast. I've got howtopronounce.com open in another window, but other than that, we'll just stumble through that, and you'll all have to wince with me. Right then, let's begin our read-through. One last note, I should say, speaking of. According to Liza, this game takes about half an hour for a single person reading silently to play through. I'm a single person reading out loud. So even if we triple that, we'll still be done well within 2 hours. We'll see what happens. So I hope that we can finish this game within our 2 hour budgeted allotment of time. Anyway, enough about me. Remove me from the situation. And we begin to read Harmonia. I have neither power, time, nor occasion to be a great conqueror, since fortune and the fates would give me none. Rather than never be mistress of a world, I have made a world of my own. Preface to The Blazing World, Margaret Lucas Cavendish, 1666. Chapter 1, November 3rd, 1998. It was midnight when I arrived on campus, and the weather was getting worse. Hours of driving led to a dark and lonely ascent into deeply forested foothills. Deeply forested foothills. There's going to be a bit of that. I hadn't seen a town for miles when I finally came upon the side for Blythedale College. This faraway place would be my home now. And this is going to be my style for coming across hyperlinks embedded in the text. Unless I have some reason not to, I'm going to read out the paragraph and then click the link, and we shall see what happens. Marginalia has appeared, which says, an obscure women's college tucked in the upper corner of Massachusetts, like a bookmark. And here we see some lovely intertextual conversation going on, tucked into the upper corner indeed. A substitute teaching position was not the big break I'd been hoping for, but it was consistent with my academic credentials, work experience, and current finances. Unimpressive. I'd received a letter extending the offer, had a brief phone call with the dean, and, unencumbered by other employment, had started packing. I'd left Boston this morning, stopping whenever the icy rain left zero visibility. Dean Orellana had made it clear, if I didn't accept the offer promptly, she had plenty more takers on hand. The road to campus was steep and barely paved, and by now, the early winter snow had turned it into a slippery mess. My aging car was fishtailing everywhere, and I nearly sideswiped a couple of trees. I'd hoped to arrive hours earlier to sip warm brandy with the faculty and argue about transcendentalism. I admit I was hazy on what real professors did in their free time. At the very least, I needed to know where I'd be sleeping. Nobody was here to welcome me. The buildings were dark and shuttered, with only slivers of weak light holding the night at bay. I couldn't find the main entrance, but I spotted a sign for the English department and parked there. I unclenched my hands from the steering wheel, took a deep breath, and hurried up to the entryway. The front door was unlocked, and no alarms rang as I stepped into the building. The interior looked like I expected. Old money New England, wood-paneled walls, rows of office doors embossed with the names of professors and adjuncts. I called out a hello, but no one answered. I recognized a few names here and there, but I was hunting for one door in particular, the absent instructor I'd been hired to replace. I found it at the end of the row, Professor Jeffrey Lynn. His door was ajar. Lynn's area of scholarship was 19th century mysticism. Mine was Civil War era proto-feminist movements. Close enough, I guess. So I let myself in and I flipped on a light. Lynn's office was a cramped, almost windowless jumble of mismatched furniture, all piled with folders, loose notes, and books. Old surveyor maps for the region were tacked to the walls. The few decorative items were 19th century junk store relics like rusty iron cranks and wooden spindles, repurposed as paperweights. Despite the clutter, the room felt abandoned. The books were an odd mix of monographs on 19th century literature and foundational engineering texts. Remarkably, a small work table by the doorway held just a single stack of papers. I recognized a draft of his class syllabus and picked it up. Look, if he didn't want somebody going through his things, he shouldn't have unexpectedly disappeared. Draft syllabus. Lynn. 19th century utopian literature. English 203. Fall semester, Blythedale College. The term was first coined by Thomas More in Utopia, 1516, but utopian literature truly flourished in the late 19th century. It often inspired, or was inspired, by real-life communes or intentional communities. Stories tend to be thin narrative window dressing over socialist tracks, heavy on detail about food production, civic engagement, and gender politics, but low on storytelling and characterization. Students should come away with an understanding of the political landscapes that shaped utopian thinking and be prepared to discuss utopian's influence on later fantasy and science fiction. Preliminary reading list. Looking Backwards, Bellamy, 1888. A Crystal Age, Hudson, 1887. Earth Revisited, Brooks, 1893. Looking Backwards. I thought that this was a natural choice. It's pretty readable and it spawned many imitators. I flipped the page over and read the excerpt Lynn had picked out. It was from Chapter 3 of the novel. Page 28 of Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy. There was a rustle of garments, and I opened my eyes. A fine-looking man of perhaps 60 was bending over me. He was an utter stranger. I raised myself on an elbow and looked around the room. I certainly had never been in it before, or one furnished like it. "Where am I?" I demanded. "You have just been roused from a deep sleep, or more properly, a trance. May I ask you when you went to sleep?" The theme of sleeping and reawakening will occur frequently. Discuss. Lynn's note to himself was scribbled in the page margin. There were 2 more pages beneath this photocopy from the book. I'm going to keep clicking. Okay, now we're getting to multiple layers of hyperlinks. Let's keep digging. Nothing clear happened when I poked to that link, and I wonder if more pages appeared literally underneath this one. Why, returning to the text, last evening, of course, at about 10 o'clock. And now, can you tell me a little more explicitly when it was that you fell into that sleep? The date, I mean. Why, last night, of course. That is, unless I have overslept an entire day. Great heavens! That cannot be possible, and yet I have an odd sensation of having slept a long time. Oh, it was Monday, May 30th. And may I ask, of what year? I stared blankly at him, incapable of speech for some moments. It was the year 1887, I said. My dear sir, he said, your appearance is that of a young man of barely 30, and your bodily condition seems not greatly different from that of one just roused from a somewhat too long and profound sleep. And yet this is the 10th day of September in the year 2000, and you have slept exactly 113 years, 3 months, and 11 days. The next excerpt was from an English utopian novel. I assumed he intended to lecture on the mechanisms by which these travelers discover their quote-unquote perfect society. Page 1 of A Crystal Age by W.H. Hudson. I do not know quite how it happened, my recollection of the whole matter ebbing in a somewhat clouded condition. While hunting for some variety of plants in the mountains, I sat down to rest on the edge of a ravine. The ground suddenly gave way all around me, precipitating me below. The fall was a very considerable one, probably 30 or 40 feet or more, and I was rendered unconscious. Another case of fall asleep, wake in future. Discuss with class. How long I lay there under the heap of earth and stones carried down in my fall it was impossible to say. Perhaps a long time, but at last I came to myself and struggled up from the debris, like a mole coming to the surface of the earth to feel the genial sunshine on his dim eyeballs. I found myself standing in an immense pit. It looked as if the solid earth had been indulging in some curious transformation during those moments of insensibility. I had a great mass of small fibrous rootlets, tightly woven around my whole person. It appeared as if the roots had grown round me. Curious, I turned to the final page in the pile. It wasn't the third novel from the syllabus, but instead what looked to be an original draft of a different one, handwritten in a looping, archaic style. I have reproduced it here in type to make it more readable. Thank you. September 30th, 1889. At last, the veil between the worlds seemed especially thin, the weather fine, and my spirits uplifted. I was determined that this was the day for my first journey in the instrument. E was hesitant, but ever is she so. She must be made to understand that this is my destiny. Once the machine was engaged, a shadow fell across my vision, and the nerves in my extremities became excited. I felt the galvanic force pass through my palm and out my feet, and then reverse, and then the feeling of sudden dissolution of the spirit, like a dandelion had gone to seed and blown by a sudden puff of breath. How long I existed in this atomized state I cannot say, but at last the cosmic force receded and I was reconstituted, weak and shattered. My sensibilities, though, were wholly in the new Eden. E, of course, was gone, and everything around me was covered in a thick layer of dust and debris. I clambered out of the device and set about exploring this miraculous place. Historical Committee brought this fragment of an epistolatory novel to my attention. Another good example of waking in the future, but I can't attribute this to any known utopian writer. Did one of the Harmonians write it? I was astonished, first by the carriages, great enclosures of iron and glass, which moved without the aid of beasts or men, and which gave off no steam. Hang on, I'm going to check the chat. Windrunner's here. Yes, I was on a couple of episodes of the Clash of the Type-Ins podcast with Ryan Veeder and Jenny Polodna. Correct. And this is mine. This is my show. Maybe I'll have them on it sometime. Turn the tables. Beasts or men, indeed. The papers were abruptly snatched out of my hand. "Excuse me, what are you doing?" A woman was silhouetted in the doorway, regarding me with suspicion. Her hair was long and plain. She wore an ankle-length, solid blue dress and carried a flashlight and a leather satchel. The beam was pointed directly at my face. I reminded myself I was invited here and didn't need to apologize. I guess technically I was trespassing in someone's office. "I'm Abby Fuller. I'm substituting for Jeffrey Lynn." Something about this answer rattled her, but she lowered her flashlight. "Oh, of course." "Thanks," I said cautiously. "There was no one here when I arrived, and look, do you know where I'm supposed to be staying? I'm very tired." "I assume the guest faculty quarters. I can take you to them." She returned the papers to the table face down and locked the door on her way out. We went back to my car to get my things. She didn't offer to help with my bags. At least the snow had stopped, turning to a fine, cold mist. There were pathetically few of them anyway. Shouldn't a grown woman have more stuff? The faculty residence was as dark and quiet as the rest of the campus. If anyone else was living there, they kept to themselves. "You can stay here," she said, gesturing at a room with a single small window and Spartan wood furnishings. I dropped everything on the floor, mumbled my thanks, and collapsed on the bed as she closed the door. Only as I was drifting off did I realize she'd never told me her name. Honestly, I was just happy I wasn't in a snow-filled ditch on the side of the road. Chapter 2. Their educational system was a peculiar one, and as it was the chief interest of the country, I shall describe it before proceeding farther with this narrative. Mizora, a Prophecy, Mary E. Bradley, 1889. I'd driven 100 miles for this job, and now I was late to my first class. 12 young women, seated in neat rows, stared back at me. I dropped my armful of papers on the lectern, and most of them slid off and fanned out onto the floor. I brushed my hair out of my face. "Welcome to 19th century utopian literature," I mumbled. And let me do that again. "Welcome to 19th century utopian literature," I mumbled. "Can't hear you," said someone in the back. "Sorry. Welcome to 19th century utopian literature. My name is Abby Fuller." Their undivided attention was disconcerting. I'd never led a class of exquisitely bred Yankee daughters. "Not yet Dr. Fuller, as my thesis was at a bit of a standstill, nor Professor Fuller, since I was only a sub. I also had no idea what material Lynn had already covered or even how many classes he held before he disappeared. A student took advantage of my halting start and raised her hand. I'd need to ask the dean about that when I saw her. I called on her and asked her name. Charlotte, she said. She was impeccably dressed, her hair perfect. She was probably featured on the school brochure. What happened to Professor Lynn? I'm substituting for him until further notice. I'm afraid I can't disclose further details, since the dean hadn't told me and I had been too grateful for the job to ask. So, utopian literature, I began again. The term was first used as the title of Thomas More's 1561 book, Utopia. Another hand went up. I could see this was going to be one of those classes. Hi, Professor Fuller. I'm Lillian Horace Ripley. It says in my notes that Utopia was actually published in 1516. I should have corrected her, but there's only so many times in one day I can be expected to debase myself. Yes, fine, sorry. Now I was flustered. Did Professor Lynn already cover this material? Many heads nodded. I looked back down at the syllabus I'd thrown together this morning. 1. Early works and influences. 2. Utopian communities. 3. British and American works, 1830 to 1900. 4. Early sci-fi. 5. Later influences. Okay, thanks. I'll make a note. I struck a line through the first lecture. Shunk. And verily a line is stricken through early works and influences. I am a compulsive scribbler, but you may have figured that out by now. Indeed. Did he cover intentional communities, or would you like me to go over that as well? I clicked on intentional communities. Oh, perhaps that was a choice. Well, what happened was I, the player, clicked on intentional communities and the text transformed significantly. So I'll read from that point. Did he cover intentional communities as well? More nods. Which one was Lily? I'm trying to keep these. Okay. Hang on. We talked about the Shakers and the other religious colonies, the girl named Lillian said, and we were supposed to cover Brook Farm and the pre-Blythedale community next. Brook Farm is a transcendentalist community located just outside of Boston, which was moderately successful until a fire destroyed their central meeting hall and bankrupted the village. Who? Blythedale College was founded on the grounds of an old utopian colony. They called the community Harmonia, Charlotte added. Eventually it failed and some of the women stayed on to found the college, Lillian finished. Huh, I said. I did not know that. So much for being the voice of authority? Lillian, again. We were supposed to start on Bellamy this week. I did the reading. Could I summarize it now? Excellent. Thank you, I said. I got the sense she was taking pity on me. Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy tells the story of a Boston man who falls into a deep sleep in 1887 and awakens in the year 2000. Heroes in utopian novels tend to tumble into holes or trances and magically transport them into the glorious socialist future. Most of the novel is a dialogue between the time traveler and the future Bostonians who find him, outlining the author's ideas about a more just society. After that rocky start, the class went pretty well. Lillian even stayed after class to welcome me to the college. She came from a notable family with deep local roots. My grandmother was named Abigail, too. I started to think this gig was going to be easy. I was wrong. The campus, which had seemed unwelcoming in the dead of night, was actually quite pleasant. It was laid out along one slope of the Berkshire foothills, in an area once cleared for agriculture but now largely forested. Almost every spot on campus afforded gorgeous views down into the valley, a rolling canopy punctuated by chimneys and whitewashed steeples. The nearest village, where most of the staff lived, was situated at the base of the hill. The largest area of level ground was the grassy central quadrangle, and many of the campus buildings, including my residence, faced out onto it. Most structures were ivy-covered brick, though a few small ones were made of rougher gray stone splashed with pastel lichen and moss. A clock somewhere chimed noon, and students poured out of the buildings, trudging up and down the steps to their next classes. It was popular to arrange one's schedule such that each subsequent class was further downslope. I drifted into the quad. Footpaths through the grass all veered around a central clearing where a stepped viewing platform encircled a curious stone peak. I hope these occasional sketches are helpful. I find drawing as soothing as obsessive journaling. And here is indeed a pencil sketch of a rock in the middle of a college campus. And there is a plaque next to the rock that says, "The Astrolith." And I will continue reading the text. It was an inky black boulder, a dozen meters around the base and pointed like a pint-sized mountain. There were bumps and cavities across its surface, which had been smoothed by age. I stooped to read a small nearby plaque. The Astrolith. This very large ataxite meteorite formed the centerpiece of the Harmonian community, who christened it the Astrolith and believed it imbued their village with scientific vitality. It was originally enclosed by the so-called phalanstery, a large multi-story communal hall. The hall's destruction by fire in 1889 precipitated the end of the community, but the Astrolith was undamaged. The circular seating was added in 1931 by the gift of an anonymous donor. The meteorite is estimated to weigh 30 tons, though it has never been fully excavated. Beneath that, a typewritten addendum was tucked into a weathered plastic sleeve. Please note, as part of the Science Center expansion, the Astrolith will be extracted and relocated to the Museum of Science in Boston. Construction is scheduled to begin in late November. We apologize for any inconvenience. And scrawled on that was some graffiti, presumably added by a student. "Say no to removal and keep Blythedale weird." A trail of construction equipment led uphill to a dreary concrete building marked Science Center. One wing of the building looked brand new, its gray blocks gleaming but no less ugly. A backhoe was parked nearby, lying in wait. A paved path ran between the meteorite and the largest building on campus, where the administrative staff worked. More importantly, the dean worked there, and she told me to check in as soon as I arrived. Amid the students coming and going from the Science Center, I recognized the odd woman who had let me in the building last night. She paused at the entrance to the building, looked around as if she didn't want to be seen, and disappeared inside. And I've skipped over some hyperlinks here. So back to, she told me to check in as soon as I arrived. Since that was the middle of the night, I hadn't yet had the chance. And the odd woman, I wanted to thank her and ask her for the keys to Lynn's office and his teaching material. I hesitated, torn between following my curiosity and meeting with the dean. And here, since I didn't recognize it earlier, I now recognize that this is a choice. So we can, following my curiosity, I suppose would be following the woman. Or we could stick with plan A and meet with the dean. You know what? Let's meet with the dean. Pick the other one. I decided it wasn't smart to leave your boss waiting. The administration building was a grand old brick edifice, fronted with tidy columns and an oversized door. The entry hall was obviously designed to impress parents and donors, and was dominated by a majestic curved stairwell with elaborate banisters and railings. Directly next to the stairs, a doorway was flanked by a freestanding brass sign that read "Current Exhibit." I leaned in and knocked on the open door. An older woman with jet black hair and a kindly face was placing some manuscripts onto a glass-top display case and didn't seem to hear the knock. "Excuse me?" I said as quietly as possible, and she jumped. "Oh, sorry to have startled you. I'm Abby Fuller. I'm substituting for Jeffrey Lynn." "Oh, no need to apologize. I just tend to get absorbed in my work. I'm Ella Merchant, a resident librarian and archivist. Welcome to our little museum." The Showy exhibit room, probably the first stop on any campus tour, was painted goldenrod and decorated with lush curtains and furnishings. Visitors could walk between 2 rows of mahogany curio cases, some still empty, filled with 19th century ephemera, ads for patent medicine, diagrams of obscure farming equipment, and blurry tintypes of serious-looking women. Cardboard boxes in the process of being emptied were strewn all over the room. "Oh, thank you," I answered. "Say, Do you happen to know where Dean Orellana's office is? Oh, come here. You'll find this so interesting, she interrupted. All we actually got out was, say, do you happen to... Come here. You'll find this so interesting, she interrupted. She retrieved a delicate fragment of newsprint from a case and put it in my hands. You may have seen they're expanding the Math and Science building, she said. The construction project has exposed a network of old tunnels that ran under many of the buildings, and we've been finding some wonderful artifacts. Many of these cellars haven't been opened since the 1890s. It's a fascinating peek at how they lived at the time. She nodded eagerly at the broadsheet in my hand, which I unfolded. The Harbinger. Together we shall shine a light. June 19th, 1889. Chemistry under difficulties. Frightful accident. Between 12 and 1 o'clock last night, the whole neighborhood was thrown into the utmost alarm by a terrible explosion in the vicinity of Professor C's laboratory. On entering that establishment, a scene of devastation plainly indicated that a scene of terrific violence had occurred. At first, no trace of the professor could be found, except a cloth cap which he was accustomed to wear while engaged in his occult investigations. Fortunately, he was found several hours later beneath the phlanstery. Professor C, you are known to be engaged in analyzing new compounds and processes of exceedingly dangerous character. While the community applauds your continued curiosity in scientific pursuits, we implore you to take heed of our concerns. We have taken the liberty of attaching large bolts to your door, securing them by means of bars through the doorposts. The best time to cut hay. Our own Mr. A writes, the best method I have found is to commence about the 10th of June and finish by the 25th. Sometimes weather prevents, so I cannot finish until the first days of July. The quality of the butter derived from this early cutting will in no time convince you to lay aside old customs and adopt this better one. Spirituality rises. Magnetism. It might be said that the magnet is a body having a spirit in it. Besides the body of the iron, there is... Wait, let me reread this. Besides the body of the iron, there is, in and around it, the influence. A vibration which is entirely invisible and intangible, yet has power to act at a considerable distance. It can operate right through a man's blood, bones, and muscles. If a magnet operates by a hidden force, it is certainly not incredible or to be regarded as strange that human beings should have spirits, that our bodies should have flowing out from them an influence as intangible and yet as effective as that of a magnet. Indeed, our ability to control our muscles is known to be due to a nervous influence similar to electricity, which has many properties of magnetism. There is known to be a relationship between electricity and the power of the will. It follows, then, that by the galvanic battery it may be possible to distill one's spirit into magnetic iron such as our Astrolith, and then to decant it again. The implications of such an instrument would be quite profound. And now the game has become Hadean lands. No. Not really, except kind of. We were interrupted by an unhappy-looking woman in the doorway. Why are there still boxes everywhere, Ella? The archivist apologized. I'm sorry, Dean. I was showing... The dean turned to me. Who are you? I'm your new English instructor, I said. She turned back to Ella. Some faculty from Harvard will be here this afternoon for a symposium. Please have this mess cleaned up before lunch. Yes, ma'am. The dean looked at me. Come to my office. Chapter 3. It was an experiment. We all risked something and must bear losses as we can. Transcendental Wild Oats, Louisa May Alcott, 1873. Dean Orellana's office was spacious, comfortably furnished, and adorned with vintage college memorabilia, group photos of serious young women in bloomers, field hockey trophies, awards for... Let me reread that again. Group photos of serious young women in bloomers, field hockey trophies, awards for comportment and elocution. A large oil painting hung over a stone fireplace. Here's another pencil sketch of what looks like the cover art of this game, an old school looking house with a horse-drawn carriage and a horse and some people in 19th century dress strolling about it, including children. The caption reads, a cheerful 19th century rendition of the college campus with a multi-story building where the quad would be today. A brass label on the bottom read, The Phalanstery. I might be pronouncing that right. Phalanstery. We'll go with that. The Phalanstery, our Great Hall, 1889. I heard your first class went reasonably well, she said without looking up from her work. She was younger than I expected, mid-40s, but no less intimidating. She wore a tightly fitted crimson suit, and I noticed that her framed Wharton MBA had been positioned to be clearly visible behind her desk. I'm glad to hear. I thought it did too, I paused. Thank you again for offering me this position. I'd been told I don't show sufficient deference to authority to be successful in academia, so I've been working on that. You're welcome. She said nothing else, just regarded me silently. People like her do this to trick you into talking too much. I fell for it, stuttering over myself. I'm wondering, what are your, can you tell me what your expectations are for me? She put her hands on her desk and very deliberately folded them. I expect you to teach utopian literature to undergrads, and then I expect to decide whether to bring you back next semester, despite your less than stellar qualifications. I was a foster kid from an old mill town, but sure, be all judgy. I understand, I said. If you could give me just a little more background on my situation. Let me reread that. I understand, I said. If you could give me just a little more background on my situation, I think it would help my teaching quite a bit. She feigned confusion. Don't you have a full syllabus from Professor Lin? That's what I'm paying you to teach. Not yet, but what would also be helpful... But... I'll get the syllabus right after this meeting, but to teach, I need context. The students expect me to be familiar with the history of this college and to speak confidently about what happened to Professor Lin. Ms. Fuller, I am very busy and I have an appointment in 10 minutes. What are you asking me? Now we can choose. Two previously non-linked words are now linked. We can ask for more about the history or more about what happened to the professor. And I think we all know, well, actually, it's not clear, but I think we're more confused about what happened. So let's click on that. I need to know what happened to my predecessor. She paused and then told me to close the door. Jeffrey Lin had been teaching here for over 10 years. His class on utopianism is a signature one for the college, given our history. We've been undertaking an expansion of the science wing as part of a strategic agenda to transform this into a research institute. I plan on making this my legacy. I got the impression that the dean gets very little stand in her way. Let's very little stand in her way. The historical significance of the campus can be an asset to us, though frankly I prefer to downplay it. It was a long time ago and the community had some unconventional ideas. In addition, any historically significant structures are a liability when it comes to modernization and development. I asked Jeffrey to lead the conservation team to protect the artifacts found during the excavations, but to balance that against an aggressive construction schedule. She nodded towards the oil painting. He was obsessed with that old hall, with finding why it burned down. I don't know why. It was made of wood, and people used candles. What other reason do you need? But Jeffrey was convinced that the artifacts contained first-person accounts of what happened, or even some physical evidence of intentional destruction. She frowned. He knew how important it was to... Start over. She frowned. He knew how important it was to me that we opened the school year with the building complete. I was extremely angry with him. And what happened to him? I asked. I told myself a dean would not actually murder a faculty member for going off schedule. Just after term started, he halted the construction project, went out one morning and stood in front of the bulldozers, said everything had to stop. He'd missed a few classes and stopped joining the regular meetings with the historical committee. You met Ella? She's the committee chair. She says he'd started going through materials from one of the old cellars by himself and not involving the group. I would have fired him if he showed his face on campus after that. Tenure be damned. But he didn't. I believe he found some artifact or another down there that was too good to pass up and ran off with it. She leaned back. I have an army of lawyers who will not be happy to see college property show up in a museum or at some auction. I frowned. When I took this assignment, I assumed he'd simply left for another job without much notice. Has he been reported missing? Are the police involved? The dean shrugged. I'm not his mother. She narrowed her eyes. You don't approve of how I've handled this, Miss Fuller? It's not for me to say, I said, neutrally. After considering me for another long moment, she stood up, and this meant I did too. You seem bright enough, Ms. Fuller. If you work hard, you may succeed with us. Speak with Alice Gilman, Lynn's research assistant. You met her the night you arrived. She can answer your remaining questions and assist with the class, and she'll have that syllabus. If she was Lynn's assistant, why hadn't she mentioned it that night? I thanked the dean and closed the door behind me. I was surprised to find my student Lillian waiting for me in the foyer. Ella said you were with the dean, she explained. Did you want to see me about something? She looked around and lowered her voice. I've been worried about Professor Lynn. Why do you say that? I think you need to see what he was working on. Come to the library with me. And now I'm going to take a water break because I am doing a lot of nonstop reading. I will be back in a moment. Thank you. And we're back. Because this was a shorter game, I didn't think I would need to prepare a taking a break slide. More fool I. The not professor is not the only ill when making bad plans tonight. I'm going to click continue. Chapter 4. Hills and valleys and sparkling cities veiled in foliage with their numberless parks and fountains and statues sleeping in the soft light. Gleaming lakes and wandering rivers that glittered and danced in the glorious atmosphere like prison sunbeams greeted us like the alluring smile of love. And yet, for the first time since entering this lovely land, I felt myself a prisoner. Missouri, Mary E. Bradley, 1890. I realized I hadn't eaten all day, and after promising to meet Lillian at the library as soon as I could, I stopped by the faculty dining room. Only a few professors were still at lunch this late. They greeted me coolly, more so I felt after I recited my unremarkable academic credentials. All stayed in commuter schools, but I still worked my ass off. After a round of polite introductions and tepid small talk, they went back to their private conversations. Excuse me. I ate my lunch in silence. As I was putting away my tray, I saw Alice Gilman open the double doors to the dining hall, notice me, and then abruptly back out again. I found Lillian Horace, my helpful student, seated on the steps around the Astrolith, seemingly oblivious to the blistery weather. Blustery? I'm going to go with blustery. Oh, it's sunny, she shrugged. I decided to just wait for you here. I'm supposed to be meeting with Alice Gilman now. We'll find her later. This is important. She handed me a worn old book, opened towards the front. Page 40, Earth Revisited, Byron A. Brooks. My whole mind was in a whirl, but out of the confusion at length came a conclusion. I could no longer doubt that I, who had lived and died in the latter part of the 19th century, was alive and strong in the 20th. 100 years later. 100 years is also the time span in Codwell's journal. Is this a shorthand like a biblical 40 years? This I could no more doubt than the consciousness that I was alive. Indeed, the impressions wrought into my being were much more real than those which I had just received from the strange scenes I had witnessed. I should not have been surprised to see them all disappear like the mirage of the desert. But even then, I reflected, I cannot doubt my own existence. I am. My dying prayer has been granted. This is the same world that I have lived in, but how changed. Ooh, what am I clicking on here? Clicky, clicky. Oh, Cadwell's journal. This book belonged to Lynn, I said. I recognize his handwriting. Who's Cadwell? That's what I want to show. A student with a clipboard and a stack of flyers suddenly accosted us. Help save the Blythedale Astrolith. Flyer text. Save the Astrolith. Stop the removal of our most famous monument. Citing bogus excuses for, quote, modernization, Blythedale plans to excavate and remove the beating heart of our school. The Astrolith is one of the few reminders of the values on which we were founded: equality, optimism, and spirituality. Join us for our rally to save the Astrolith and keep Blythedale weird. Save the date, November 24th. Yeah, thanks, Lillian said. Once the student was out of sight, she crumpled the flyer in her hand and stalked off towards the library. You don't agree? I asked, jogging to keep up. I don't have time. The current library building was a brutalist relic of the 1960s and didn't exactly gel with the rest of the campus. In spite of that, it was a quiet and pleasant place to study, with abundant natural light, and a wall of glass that overlooked the small orchard at the edge of campus. Naturally, we were headed for a windowless basement instead. Most of the Utopians' buildings were made out of wood. It was the one resource they had in abundance, Lillian explained. They were largely replaced when the college was founded. She unlocked a door marked Library Personnel Only and led me in. The only original structures that are still standing are a few stone houses used as faculty residences. Meanwhile, I get this crappy little space for my independent study. The office was barely bigger than a storage closet and was crammed with equal amounts of library books and janitorial equipment. You mentioned your family attended Blythedale? Yeah, I come from a long line of alumna. American universities give special preference to the descendants of graduates. Not having illustrious ancestors of my own, I'm not a fan of the practice. Mom, grandmom, great-grandmom, I'm named after her. She was in the first graduating class at Blythedale. They call us founders' daughters. There's a formal social club and everything. I find it all pretty boring. Not many people come from a line of women scholars, Lillian. It's okay to be proud of that. God, I sound so square sometimes. I'd clearly embarrassed her, so she changed the subject. Here, this is what I wanted to show you. July 17th, 1889. I resume after a lull in my work. Our neighbors were becoming more vocal in their complaints. See the Harbinger for numerous examples, reports of strange explosions, sounds, smells. I'll wait to click on that one. Clearly, it's how we continue anyway. I admit difficulty in containing some of the experiments. There have been fires. Let's reread that. There have been fires, and I have had to resort to asking E to steal scraps of metal and wood to replace my damaged equipment. By moving the entire apparatus below ground, I eliminated the danger of prying eyes and ears, but progress has slowed due to the poor lighting down there and the need to further enlarge the natural workspace. I've seen the Harbinger, I said. It was the Utopians newsletter. Professor Lin found dozens of these journal fragments dating from between 1885 and 1889. I'd been helping him analyze them all summer, trying to fit them into a timeline that matched with the decline of the community. Are you sure this is from someone's journal? I asked. This looks like a page from a novel that I found with Lynn's notes. No, this is definitely the personal diary of a community member. His name was Ignatius Cadwell, some kind of amateur scientist. Bit of a blowhard, if you ask me. Maybe he was also a frustrated novelist. She laughed. That would explain a lot. He seemed to think he could do anything. Now, read the other one. This is from 4 months later. November 22nd, 1889. I write in haste and with great fatigue. I can barely recall what sleep feels like, but there is no more work to be done and no turning back. The instrument is complete. This community was founded with the goal of realizing a scientific way of life. It is clear that we have failed. Our founding members have left us, and our once great experiment dissolves faster each day. It is all too clear to me now that the society of today is too resistant to change. E and I will descend beneath the Great Hall, where I will say my final words to this world, and together we will operate the device. I only hope to find a way for her to join me in the next world, the true Harmonia. You were always an insufferable fool. Okay. I pointed out the note in the margin. Oh, in colored pencil and almost illegible. Who added this note? That's not Lynn's writing. I don't know. Maybe another utopian. Does it matter? She tapped the page. On November 23rd, 1889, the day after this was written, the Great Hall burned down. It took a lot of other structures with it and some livestock, maybe even some people. The community went bankrupt, just like Brook Farm did. But the fire was probably an accident. I've only found one first-person account of the fire, and she mentions hearing an explosion, not some oil lamp tipping over. If you read between the lines there's no turning back. That sounds like he was planning something extreme. Maybe Cadwell built a kind of bomb to finish off a utopian dream that failed. I didn't know what to say to that. Lillian took the papers out of my hands. Professor Lynn could have found something dangerous in those tunnels. I don't think he was the kind of person who'd run off with stolen artifacts. Maybe he was injured down in some cellar. People accidentally dig up old mines all the time. Well, yes, in some places. But even then, I'd hardly say it was all the time. You're not listening. They're going to resume construction on the Science Center any day now. What if they rupture something explosive? People could get injured or worse. I sighed. Lillian, what do you expect me to do? I just got here 2 days ago. As a substitute, you have access to Lynn's private papers. I've asked for them, but Ms. Gilman won't let me see them, and the dean isn't interested in anything that delays the construction. Please, she said. I don't know who else to ask. I'd say that her passion and conviction reminded me of my younger self, but if I'm honest, I was never very idealistic. It felt good to be needed, and I liked Lillian. Okay, I said finally. Let me see what you got. Chapter 5. There was one moment, whilst the whole frame yet stood, that surpassed all else. It was fire throughout. It seemed like a magnificent temple of molten gold or a crystallized fire. The smoke as it settled off the horizon gave the effect of sublime mountain scenery, and during the burning, the trees, the woods shone magically to their minutest twigs in lead, silver, and gold. Mary Ann Dwight, resident of Brook Farm in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, 1846. Lillian sent me away with a heavy load of books, papers, and troubled thoughts. I retreated to my room, my things still largely unpacked, and went through her documents one by one. It did not escape my notice that the student had given me homework. Her hypothesis that there had been a deliberate violent act towards the community was suggestive, but not quite convincing. Ignatius Cadwell was indeed one of the founding members of Harmonia. This was the Professor C. chastised for his experiments in the newspaper column. He'd answered a classified ad for recruits posted in one of the many spiritualist newspapers at the time. Lynn had a copy. A new Eden. Learned men with open minds and sturdy backs, you are wanted for a new community. Join like-minded free thinkers as we build a scientific way of living as equals before God and man, guided by science and spirit alike. Inquire at 10 Broad Street, Boston, Massachusetts. Cadwell and his wife, Elise Cadwell was featured only sparsely in the records, moved to the nascent, never know how to pronounce that word, I'm going to go with nascent, the nascent Harmonia community in 1885, along with about 75 other would-be utopians. The population waxed and waned for several years, peaking at 110 in the summer of 1888, until an irreversible slide meant that only 20 families remained at the time of the Great Hall fire in November 1889. taking another water break. There was ample evidence in her documents that Cadwell was building something that he wished to keep secret, something that caused rumbles in the night, acrid smells, and prolonged absences from community obligations. The Harmonians traded extensively with the local villages. Like many intentional communities, the population was dominated by intellectuals, not farmers, and struggled to feed itself through the long winters. And Cadwell's purchases were quite strange for a fledgling farm community. Large quantities of copper wire, yards of, quote, India rubber, and so many pounds of brass sheeting that, quote, the horse carts struggled for hours to climb the steep roads to the village. But I wasn't sure he was building a bomb. I kept coming back to that journal fragment I found in Lynn's office the night I arrived. Both Lynn and I had assumed it was a draft of a fantastical story, and that made for curious timing. Who takes a break from their grand destructive plan to work on their novel? My efforts to put off my dissertation notwithstanding. I needed to get that fragment back and find more of them if they existed. Surely Lynn, an academic, kept a journal of his own. At the very least, he ought to have documentation of the materials recovered from the excavations. Collecting my thoughts, I jotted down 3 options. 1. Convince Lynn's assistant, the elusive Alice Gilman, to let me go through his papers. I bet if I click on jotted down, more things will happen. As I said, I'm always scribbling things down. Okay, maybe not. In fact, I should have done this already. I really needed that syllabus, but I was sensing that this woman was avoiding me. 2. Break into his office myself. Did I know how to do this? I did not. 3. Forget Lynn's existing papers and search the campus for others. I could start with the Science Center expansion. Surely the tunnels that the historical community were excavating hadn't been completely exhausted. There was technically a 4th option. 4. Just drop it, keep my head down, and teach this class. Immediately struck through. Almost inevitably, this investigation would lead to a dead end, so I'd come to this choice eventually, and I couldn't bear to disappoint Lillian so soon. So I was left to choose between talking my way in there, committing some light burglary, or playing archaeologist. Okay. Do we want to go charisma, dexterity, or intelligence? I always go with a charisma build with my CRPGs. Let's do it. I might regret it, but at least I had a plan. Chapter 6. God did not make us perfect. He left us something to do for ourselves. Unveiling a Parallel. Alice Jones and E. Merchant, 1893. One of the unique properties of speculative fiction is the way it reflects the social context in which it was written, I lectured. Can anyone give me some examples from the readings that you found particularly illuminating? I called on a shy girl in the back. Maria? I was surprised by how many utopias are described as vegetarian, she said in her quiet voice. Good. Can you find a relevant passage? I asked. She nodded and read aloud. I like to ask shy kids to read out loud as a way of getting them comfortable with speaking in class. Oh, that's very nice of you. Page 75, Missouri, Mary E. Bradley. Animals and domestic fowls had long been extinct in Missouri. This was the one cause of the weird silence that so impressed me on my first view of their capital city. Invention had superseded the usefulness of animals in all departments. In the field and the chemistry of food, artificial power was utilized for all vehicles. The association of animals is degrading, the preceptress asserted, and you, who still live by tilling the soil, will find a marked change economically in dispensing with your beasts of burden. 19th century futurists tended to be much more practical than their counterparts a century later. Fewer flying cars, more motorized tractors, and basic sanitations. Fully 4/5 that you raise on your farms is required to feed your domestic animals. If your agriculture was devoted entirely to human food, it would make it more plentiful for the poor. I did not like to tell her that I knew many wealthy people who housed and fed their domestic animals better than they did their tenants. Thank you, Maria. That was an excellent example. She blushed. The door in the back of the lecture hall opened, and to my surprise, Alice Gilman slid in and took a seat towards the back. I nodded to her in acknowledgement, but she didn't respond. I addressed the class again. Remember, this was a time before refrigeration, when food products were frequently spoiled or adulterated. Strange as it seems to us, the idea of substituting real foods with artificial ones was considered a huge step forward. Many of the actual utopian communities, including ours here, practiced vegetarianism, Lillian added. With reason, Gilman said unexpectedly. A couple of students turned around and glared at her. I understand not wanting to eat meat, Maria ventured, but it's hard to imagine anyone today wishing to eradicate all animals. Animals stink, Gilman said. Civilized people shouldn't live with that filth. There was an awkward silence. Gilman must be fun at faculty parties. Thank you for joining us, Ms. Gilman, I said, smiling through gritted teeth. Would you mind staying after class so we could speak? I returned to lecturing. Other recurring themes that you found surprising? Education? Charlotte volunteered. A lot of novels mention the subject of universal schooling, especially the books authored by women. I had expanded Lynn's male-dominated reading list by quite a bit. Terrific point, and critical to understanding the history of this college. What's an example? Charlotte started to read. Page 58. 300 years hence. Mary Griffith. The two friends entered the famous Philadelphia market. Women, dressed in close caps and snow-white aprons, stood or sat modestly by their baskets, not as formerly bawling out to the passers-by and entreating them to purchase of them, but waiting for their turn with patience and good humor. Their hair was all hidden, save for a few plain braids or plaits in front, and their neck was entirely covered. Their dress was appropriate to their condition, and their bearing had both dignity and grace. Well, this surpasses belief, said Hastings. Are these the descendants of that coarse, vulgar, noisy, ill-dressed tribe, one half of whom appeared before their dirty baskets and crazy fixtures with tawdry finery, and the other half in sluttish, uncouth clothes with their hair hanging about their face or stuck up behind with a greasy horn comb? I hesitated about assigning this book. It's awfully racist too, but that's how so many people of the period, especially women, regarded the poor. What has done all this? Why, the improvement which took place in the education of women. Education reform was important, I said. The system of state-run public schools that we know today was still being formed in the mid-1800s. And while we might take universal free education for granted as obvious social good, some thinkers of the 19th century, even women, saw education mostly as an opportunity to remake minority and immigrant populations in their own idealized image. Or worse, many of these utopian novels and the real-life communities were enthusiastically eugenicist. Gilman was frowning and sat with her arms crossed, but remained silent. It was Maria who spoke up again. Can I read from something else? Of course. Ella Merchant, the librarian, gave me this the other day. She knew I was taking this class and wasn't sure what book it was from. She just found it among some Harmonian papers. She stood up and read in a more confident voice. I have to admit she made me proud. As the village awakened, I was aware of a profound absence. I saw no men at all. Had they been eliminated in this time and place? Eventually they did appear, but so few, doing mostly menial work, while tall women in strange clothing, some wearing trousers or next to nothing at all, drifted impassively along without a care in the world. Isn't that interesting, Miss Fuller? She asked me. It reminded me of the novel we read last class by Annie Cridge. Gilman had risen. Maria, she said, may I see that? But I was closer and snatched the paper from the girl first. Oh. Gilman said that. I'm going to reread that. Gilman had risen. Maria, she said, may I see that? But I was closer, and I snatched the paper from the girl first. No need, Ms. Gilman. Perhaps we can return this to Lynn's full collection of documents after lecture. I looked down at the page. This was an original 19th century document written in one familiar hand and heavily annotated in another. October 13th, 1889. I arrive this time in daylight and not darkness. To fully convey the strangeness of my journey, I shall describe each sense's impression in turn. It was dawn, yet there was a deep quiet. No roosters, nor soft murmuring of cows, nor sounds of my neighbors performing their morning chores. As if you ever did such work yourself. As the village awakened, I was aware of a profound absence. I saw no men at all. Had they been eliminated in this time and place? Perhaps they should have been. Eventually they did appear, but so few, doing mostly menial work, while tall, young women in strange clothing, because it is a college for women, arrogant mule, some wearing trousers or next to nothing at all, drifted impassively along without a care in the world. Then all at once I became aware of my sense of smell. Gone was the miasma of beasts. Animals stink. We are well rid of them. And it was not replaced with coal smoke or even the scent of wood fire. There was only the sweet odor of trees and fresh air. Many of the students were talking at once. Charlotte... Wait, was somebody reading this out loud? Many of the students were talking at once. Charlotte was asking if this book was on the assigned reading list. Maria noted that the story sounded like a description of Blithedale itself. Lillian was scowling, flipping through her own notes. I fixed my eyes on Gilman, who was backing out towards the door. "Thank you, Maria," I said. "I did find that very illuminating." Chapter 7. I was filled with astonishment at women who, qualified by nature and fortune to have the world almost at their command, chose to seclude themselves from it and make a new one for themselves. Millennium Hall, Sarah Scott, 1762. Gilman slipped out moments later. I didn't want her to get far, so I ended class early. The students raised no objections, unsurprisingly. I pulled Lillian aside and instructed her to talk to the librarian and collect any more stray journal entries. When I got outside, I spotted Gilman hurrying across the quad. She was dressed about the same as when I met her. Long skirt, leather bag, plain brown boots. But now her hair was pulled back into an elaborate coil that made her stand out among the students. The weather had turned to icy rain again, which stung my face as I trotted after her. I was feeling bold. So when she reached the doors of the English department, I stepped in before she could close them. "Hi, Alice," I said. "You know, I meant it when I said I wanted to catch up after class." She stiffened. 2 faculty members were in the hall. They paused, sensing tension. I recognized one who spurned me in the dining hall. I doubted they liked Gilman any more than they liked me. "Let's talk in Professor Lynn's office," I smiled. "At the dean's request." Gilman was trapped, and she knew it. "All right," she said. I followed her down the hall, where she unlocked Lynn's office. We were finally alone. "Thank you for your help the other night," I said, even as I walked around his office, casually browsing through the papers on his desks. "You're welcome," she replied. "Forgive my curiosity, but where are you from? I don't recognize your accent." The question was rude, and she responded in kind. "Not far from here. You're from where, Lowell?" Something like that? Exactly like that, but I didn't want to give her the satisfaction. Before she could respond with what I assumed would be snobbery, a student appeared in the doorway, grinning and full of annoying verve. "Rally at dawn to save the Astrolith," she said, pushing a fire at me. "Construction resumes tomorrow if we don't stop it." The flyer was a reproduction of the Utopians newsletter. A student had placed a cheerful sticker in one corner. "The Harbinger. Together we shall shine a light. November 23rd, 1884. The Astrolith emerges. The future is now. Join us in the phalanstery to celebrate the commencement of our spiritual journey together. The Astrolith, symbol of our divine providence and infuser of vitality, has been unveiled. Demonstrations of the power of magnetism, galvanic forces, and spiritual science will be provided by Professor C. Prayers. Will be provided by Professor C. Name is not Professor C. Prayers. Will be provided by Professor C. Prayers, speeches, and readings will continue through the evening. All are welcome." November 23 is Astrolith Day. Keep Blythedale weird. See you in the quad tomorrow. What construction? Gilman said, her voice wavering a bit. The digging was halted until at least the spring. The girl shrugged. I don't know. That's just what everybody's saying. Guys with hard hats, inspectors, they're all over the science center now. Gilman stormed past both of us, startling the girl, only to run straight into Lillian and Ella, the archivist. She nudged them aside without a word and disappeared down the hall. What was that about? Lillian said, exacerbated, and then abruptly shut Lynn's door in the bewildered student's face. That would have been funny under any other circumstance. Did you find Lynn's papers yet? Lillian cut in. No, I was dealing with Gilman, and I couldn't find anything in this mess. His current research is kept in... who's Merchant? I'm lost. Whatever. His current research is kept in this cabinet, Merchant said, pulling... Oh, that's the archivist. Got it, right? Hang on, I'm going to go back a little bit. I want to get these things right. Ella Merchant, I suppose. Okay. His current research is kept in this cabinet, Merchant said, pulling open an unmarked drawer, as if at random, producing 2 annotated journal entries from among other paperwork. Thanks, I said, feeling stupid. Next time, just ask. Finding documents is my job. We laid them out on a table and read them together. And now we see the... I think this is the stuffy male academic that I was promised, the author of these journal entries. June 2nd, 1888. Is there anything more beautiful than Harmonia in the summer? We are in high spirits as yet more members have joined us at our grand experiment this spring. That would be the high point of the population for them. Most of these new recruits are gone by winter. The new men are strong and capable, their wives and sisters handsome. I am confident that our harvest this year will be sufficient to all but eliminate our dependence on supplies from North Adams and elsewhere. This month was my turn at digging work group. More evidence of a network of supply tunnels and cellars. Do these still exist? Of course, I was too busy with my galvanic experiments to waste time with manual labor. I prevailed upon E to find me a replacement, and she succeeded as she does all things. Only one Harmonian was known to be an engineer, I. Cod Cadwell. Dropped out of MIT in 1878, no record except marriage certificate in 1882, joined Harmonia at the founding in 1883. She is so devoted to my work, as an example to all of our husbands and wives who seek a more scientific marriage. Lynn's annotations are undated, Merchant said, but this looks to be one of his earlier finds. She held up the second document. These notes were made more recently. I recovered this fragment myself in late August. August 1st, 1889. I have completed our experiments with small animals, first chickens and then dogs. For the most part, they have all returned successfully, and as such, I am convinced of the readiness of the device for a human being. Of course, it would be foolish for me to be the first to enter. If anything were to go awry, it would hardly be possible for E to fix it. After much consternation, I convinced E of the rightness of my plan. If only all our wives were so rational in their thinking, we would have not had seen the departure of so many families this year. As I have detailed in the blueprint, the device requires 2 to operate, a flywheel address and a subsequent design. Given the sensitivity, I am keeping this in my personal collection for now. After a final disagreeable conversation, we entered the workspace via the eastern tunnel. No excavation of this tunnel to date if the workspace is where I believe it to be. E ascended to the platform and I engaged the galvanic engine. While achieving sufficient rotational speed, the engine exceeds the tolerance of its brass enclosure. Stronger rivets are required, I believe. But I succeeded, and E underwent the transfiguration of her spirit as planned, and I returned her to our world as we agreed, no more than 10 minutes thence. Frustrating lack of detail here. I have no words, she said upon return, all her former doubts extinguished. Truly, it is a new Eden. What did you think of this when you found it? I asked. Ella looked puzzled. One of the colonists drafting a fantastical story, she said. Jeffrey and I agreed it wasn't surprising to find. It's natural that the Harmonians would try out their ideas in story form. The cross-pollination between fiction and real-life communities happened frequently. Whole societies rose and fell around stories like Looking Backward and Travels in Icaria. Lillian and I exchanged a look but said nothing. Where are those tunnels that Lynn refers to in his note? If he was writing in August, he was probably talking about the one under the Science Center, Ella said. He halted the expansion of the foundation when they broke through to an old root cellar. That's when Jeffrey started going down there alone. I didn't like it, but I couldn't stop him without involving the dean. The last entry mentions a blueprint. If Lynn put that in a, quote, personal collection, where would that be? Would he have kept papers like that here? No. Dean had me catalog all the college property in his office after he disappeared, and I don't recall anything like a blueprint. His home, maybe? He lived in Adam's house. The name was meaningless to me. That's right on campus, Lillian explained. One of the original stone Harmonian buildings. The 5 extant utopian homes were named after the families who built them. I have keys to some offices, Ella said, but not to anyone's private residence. I talked my way through one locked door, I said. I can figure out another one. Chapter 8. It was a beautiful world, but it was not my world. Moving the Mountain, Charlotte Perkins Gilman, 1911. I skulked around outside the dean's office until I saw her leaving for the day. In my head, I rehearsed a dramatic story in which I needed materials from Lynn's home due to a quote-unquote teaching emergency. For some reason, this wasn't coming together all that convincingly. As the dean put on her coat, I approached her and received a disapproving scowl when she seemed to remember something and turned back. She began berating her young assistant, who was also packing up for the day. Walter, did you finish assembling the press packet yet? He froze with the look of someone who knows there will be no good answer to this question. I was going to put it together tonight at home. I don't want those materials leaving the campus. This isn't a free-for-all where faculty and staff can just waltz off with whatever they like. She looked pointedly at me before jangling her keys. I doubt she thought I'd already stolen from them, but sooner or later I inevitably would. Stay here until it's finished, she said, and left. Walter sat down with the deliberate slowness of someone who has been here many times before. Can I help? I said. No, it's fine. You're Abby Fuller, the new instructor? Yes, and I need a pretty big favor from you, so really, let me help. I waited until after dark to meet up with my fellow burglars by the row of picturesque stone houses along the west side of campus. They were 5 neatly hewn stone cubes that over the years had been extended and renovated in slightly different ways. Lynn's house was one of the smaller ones, set back a bit. Are we all okay doing this? I asked. Ella Merchant looked unsure, but then sighed. Jeffrey would want us to find out what happened to him, she said. Lillian nodded in agreement. Okay, then. Lillian had brought flashlights for all of us. We kept them off until I put the key I got from Walter in the lock and opened Lynn's door. The whole house was smaller than some apartments I've had, just 3 rooms plus a small modern addition. The furnishings were generic and had probably come with the housing. It looked barely lived in. He must have spent most of his time at the office. I explored the kitchen following the scent of neglected garbage. I was relieved to smell nothing worse. The flashlight beam illuminated a barely stocked kitchen, consistent with someone who ate mostly at the dining hall. A cellar door had been left open. The door was next to the old stone hearth. The door frame was narrow and low, obviously original to the property, and there was no light switch by the top of the stairs. I thanked Ella for her help so far and told her to go home. I don't want anyone losing their job over this. She looked grateful and promised to assist us in any way with whatever materials we came back with. I turned to Lillian. You too. No way. You'll get expelled, and I don't think the dean will write a nice recommendation letter. Go home. No, she said, folding her arms. Then wait outside. It's freezing. Then go home. I felt responsible for the girl, despite the fact that she got me into this mess. Lillian bit her lip. I'll be in the library. Then she left. I was alone. The cellar was far smaller than a modern basement. The ceiling brushed the top of my head. Successive floods had coated the floor in layers of earth, and the various boxes and tools were all crusted with dirt. I could hear a rumbling and feel a vibration through the ground, not necessarily from below me, but seemingly from all around. Nothing looked new enough to have belonged to Lynn, and I didn't see any other promising exits. Yet, the door had been open. Someone had been down here, and that sound came from somewhere. I'd just have to search carefully. Ceiling, floor, or boxes? Well, we're here for papers. The ceiling is close to hand. I don't know. Let's look at the ceiling. Cobweb-infested struts interrupted by an occasional load-bearing brick pillar. And the floor? When I aimed the flashlight beam directly at the ground, a set of prints were visible, clustered around one of the boxes in the far corner. Well, cracked wooden crates, mostly empty or full of more dirt-covered tools. The footprints were clustered around one box, pushed up against the cellar wall. I slid the box away from the wall, revealing a narrow tunnel into further darkness. The tunnel was obviously hand-dug and surprisingly long. It wasn't just a connector to another nearby cellar. It was framed in wood, but inexpertly, with boards nailed together at all angles. The planks overhead sagged, and a few had been split by tree roots, which burst out from the cracks and hung freely. The tunnel descended, and if my orientation was correct, it was cut into the slope of the hill. This did not feel safe. I inched through it with care, trying to brush the dangling roots and loose boards aside with minimal force. One of the boards fell off under my touch, landing on the ground with a dull thud. Soil spilled down on my head and I held my breath, but the falling dirt gradually subsided and the tunnel was silent again. The board I dislodged had some handwritten graffiti on it. I will be welcomed in the New Eden, November 23rd, 1889. I was quite sure by now that this handwriting belonged to Elise Cadwell, Ignatius Cadwell's wife. And I'm going to take a water break. One moment. After 5 or 6 meters, the tunnel made a sharp left-hand turn and descended even further. Once I turned the corner, the deep mechanical humming intensified. From this point on, the tunnel was getting wider, until I stumbled down a short step and I was no longer in a tunnel at all. I aimed the flashlight around, but the beam was insufficient and nothing I saw made any sense. I could perceive only disjointed scenes that didn't form a coherent whole. Curved metal plates that vibrated, cables and hoses snaking upwards and out of sight that belched steam and smoke. Motes of dust and soot churned in the air, and my weak light only served to reflect them back at me in a disorienting visual static. I called out, but the sound of my voice was swallowed by the mechanical churning. I could not make out the scale of the space, but the resonant sound told me the walls and ceiling were far, far away. I wasn't in a root cellar anymore. This was a cavern filled with a great machine. Chapter 9. What is the breath of life? I ask at last. Oh, I can answer that. I have found it out since I have been here. It is, my dear, electricity, which we assimilate into spirit. Arctique. Anna Adolph, 1889. By my feet lay evidence of recent habitation, plastic milk crates, some rubber gloves, a few empty bags of potato chips, a gas generator. The generator was off. Something else was driving the mechanized drone, filling the room. I followed the cables, snaking out of it with my flashlight beam. They led to a series of tripod-mounted spotlights, all dark, positioned around the cave. Lying on top of the generator, as if deliberately placed there to be impossible to miss, was a manila folder. I opened it, tucking the flashlight under my arm to free both hands. The first page inside was an original issue of The Harbinger, annotated by Lynn. This edition was from the end of the community's existence, when the full-length newspaper had shrunk to a single double-sided broadsheet. The Harbinger. Together we shall shine a light. November 14th, 1889. A note to our readers. Sad day. This will be the last edition of The Harbinger for the year, possibly forever. It is no longer possible to keep up a brave face. Our experiment is at an end. We are perplexed by debts, by want of capital to carry on any business. The debt would exceed more than $30,000, a vast sum in those days, including the losses incurred by the fire at the uninsured Great Hall. We lose more members than we gain. We are unable to supply our own needs from our gardens, and we sell naught but milk and hay, to whose prices do not sustain us, no matter how many luxuries we forego. The Governing Council has voted to disband the Joint Stock Company. All existing shareholders will be paid out the fair value of their investment. We invite those who own or wish to buy their homes to stay. Only a dozen utopians did so, mostly single women, but that was enough to sustain them through the founding of the college. Our sole profitable venture has been our school, and many of us seek to continue that work, or even to extend it. We have seen the benefits that equal education for boys and girls bring, and we believe there is yet more work to do there. Blythedale was co-ed until 1906, when a new charter was established after a bitter debate. Plea for a safe return. Mr. M. writes, if any man has taken it upon himself to remove my chickens from their enclosure, I promise before the community to lay no claims on him if they are but returned unharmed. To the instrument. Anonymous writes, certain that Cadwell was the author here, fragments of this text appear on the back of the device diagram attached. As we grapple with the dissolution of our grand experiment, I call upon our community to remember the grand scientific discoveries we have made together. Remember that we are composed of minute and invisible particles of matter, endowed with attributes such as we are wont to associate with larger masses. If you find difficulty in imagining this, remember that every grain of sand is a microcosm, sharing in the innate motions which pulsate through the universe. And remember further that there are specks infinitely smaller than grains of sand in which a heart beats and blood circulates, and all the functions of an exuberant vitality are exercised. All of this can be instrumented with the aid of great ancient spiritual and scientific force. There was another paper behind the broadsheet. It was quite damaged and stained, as if from frequent use. Here we see another pencil sketch that looks very, I'm just going to go out and say mist-like. It looks very Randian. The other kind of Randian. I can't remember the names of the mist guys. I think Rand is a first name. Anyway, my point is, it is a lovely pencil sketch of a great contraption that appears to be hewn into a rock with a woman at the bottom operating a huge lever and a top-hatted man. I'm assuming their genders here by their silhouette dress, standing in a sort of compartment at the top of a rickety-looking ladder. And at the bottom, in the orange handwriting, it says, "Every grain of sand a microcosm. Will I ever be free of him?" Beneath Elise's transcription on the page, she'd added another note at a later date. "I hope you burned with the rest of them." I put the folder aside, my hands shaking a little. "All right," I hollered. "All right," I hollered over the industrial din. "If there's someone in here, I'm turning on the lights now." I pulled the starter cord on the generator. The motor shuddered, but didn't rev up. I waited, but there was only that continual hum and room-filling vibration. I yanked on the cord again, this time both harder and faster. The generator roared to life, and the spotlights lit up in sequence. What I saw made me need to sit down. I was, in fact, within an enormous cavern, sunken deep into the slope on which the college was built. The space was dominated by a pock-marked black boulder the size of a house, which protruded from the ceiling and disappeared into the floor, half its girth buried in the wall of the cavern. Oh, I'm going to go back to this drawing. Okay, that's okay. So we can see at the top of it, that is the thing, and it extends far into the earth, and the machine is built into it. Yes, indeedy. Which protruded from the ceiling and disappeared into the floor, half its girth buried into the wall of the cavern. It looked like an immense ebony tooth wrapped in brass and iron. The Astrolith, I murmured. The color and composition of the rock was the same, and the shape of the peak in the sketch was unmistakable. The plaque by the meteorite estimated its weight at 30 tons, assuming the bulk of it was above ground. What I saw in front of me demonstrated that to be laughably wrong. The machinery depicted in the drawing, though demonstrably functional, had been built long ago. Rubber tubes had cracked or sprung from their sockets. The brass cranks and gears were coated in a thick, crusty patina. Many of the planks had long fallen to the ground, and the enormous wheel and crankshaft were wrapped in copper wire which had oxidized to a dull green. Debris was everywhere. Yet someone had been restoring it. Lynn, presumably, though he must have been pretty handy for an English professor. All along the edge of the cavern were modern tools and materials. Shiny new wire spools, a table saw, neat stacks of fresh lumber. Someone had restored it, and now the machine was humming and alive. I approached the device carefully, as one would a wild animal. Surely this was no bomb. Up close, I could see what parts had been replaced, including the ladders and much of the platforms. There was a new handle on the enormous lever by the base, mounted on a half-moon track like a railroad track switch. I'm going to not click on that right now. A handcart full of fresh coal rested next to a cast iron stove. Tantalizingly, the ladder led up to a 2-stage platform. The upper platform ended in a chamber which seemed carved out of the meteor itself. I climbed up the rungs just to get a better look over the edge. Okay, I'll click on railroad track switch. For good reason, the machine was largely pieced together from farm and railroad parts, and then getting a better look over the edge. I peered over the edge of the first platform. A small work area was staged here, another milk crate, a gas camping lamp, and a notebook, so perfectly arranged that they felt like props. I climbed up anyway. I do not regret walking into this trap, not for one moment. And here is a sketch of the trap in question. That does look very staged. This art is very good, by the way. I'm curious who made it. I was about 10 feet off the ground now, and close to the huge wheel-like mechanism. The wheel seemed designed to rotate freely, but was just vibrating now, throwing off occasional blue-white sparks. I could make out gleaming new copper threads interwoven with the old. From this distance, it was obvious how much the machine had been pieced together from 19th century spare parts. Looking up, I could see the meteorite disappear into the roof of the cavern, which was held together by packed dirt and a dense web of roots. I sensed that the cavern itself was natural, a pocket in the earth created when the meteorite crashed into the side of the valley thousands or millions of years ago. I picked up the notebook. It had a recent date on the cover in Lynn's handwriting. This was the personal journal I'd been searching for. To my disappointment, it was largely blank, just 2 short fragments hastily written. August 30, 1998. The committee delays were endless, so I've taken matters into my own hands. I suppose as a scholar I should be ashamed of myself for damaging an archaeological site, but if Orellana has her way, this will all be rubble in the end. The excavation was tedious but uncomplicated work, loose soil, rocks, fragments of burnt timber. I assume these were parts of the Great Hall. The hard part was actually crawling through. The original tunnel wasn't dug wide enough to accommodate a sedentary modern man. Hunched over as I wasn't able to take in the chamber until I was fully inside it, and then, what a wonder. Despite all my research, despite all my research, everything I've risked to my reputation, the neglect of my students, I guess I didn't fully believe it would be real. But it is, just as Cadwell described. I can't wait to show Alice. I hope that she will aid me in repairing. The entry just stopped. The next page picked up a few days later. September 1st, 1998. Alice has been wonderful. She's managed to locate all the materials we need. Where do you even find coal? And by bringing them down in the dead of night, she has thus far avoided drawing any attention to this work. The amount of scholarship that will flow from this discovery is unimaginable. I will need to reward her generously for her efforts. Perhaps a bouquet of flowers. We have been working in the cavern now almost nonstop. I'm afraid I may have missed some classes. The students will understand, surely. But, of course, the right thing to do would be to go to public immediately and get a team of professionals down here. But the moment I do so, I lose control. And while it seems mad, I can't shake the belief that it's almost ready to try. I write this now by the hum of the generator. Alice said she found another one of Cadwell's journals that detailed the last step of the process, how to rewind the intricate copper coils and tighten the springs inside of the rotor. She thinks we're only a few days from success. How she can be so certain, I don't know. I looked up towards the top of the platform, at the chamber that had been dug into the heart of the meteorite. A brass doorframe had been somehow affixed to it, and a glass-fronted door hung open in invitation. The final platform was small, barely wider than the doorframe. Up this high, the vibration of the idling machine was intense. My teeth ached, and the wooden structure on which I stood swayed noticeably. Rubber cables snaked through the doorframe and attached at a socket in the chamber ceiling. A thickly woven metal cord hung down, ending in a brass handle. Absurdly, I was reminded of an old-fashioned toilet flush. Directly over the handle was a floor-mounted brass plate. Naturally, lying on the plate was another journal entry in Lynn's hand. I was obviously following deliberate breadcrumbs. What was the last one? September 1st. So this is September 10th, 1998. I came down this morning after she'd gone to bed. I thought I'd just help out, take out the food waste, I don't know. I guess I was spying on her. She'd asked me to stay out of her way. She said she didn't want to be disturbed. That's all, Jeffrey, but I know it was because she'd long stopped consulting Cadwell's papers anymore, as if she'd no longer needed them, or no longer need them at all. I asked again about that large pile of stones behind the coal stove, and she was as evasive as ever. Oh, there's nothing back there. Look, it's just old rocks. Fishy, I thought. I decided to just take a peek. Didn't have to spend much time digging through until I found Cadwell. I assume it's him anyway. There's a little more than a skeleton. Dry rags of clothes still hang from it. A tin cup and a bucket by his side. And of course his journal, which makes it clear that he died here in this room. At least she thought to give him a kind of burial. God forgive me, I covered him back up. If she knows that I found him, well, I can see what'll happen to me. But if I feign ignorance a little longer, I'll get a chance to experience what other historians can only dream of. Someone shoved me from behind, and I stumbled into the chamber. The door was slammed shut on me and locked. I heard a curious sucking noise and felt my ears pop. The rumble of the engine became muted, and yet I could also now feel it, oddly calming. It emanated from the meteor itself. Alice Gilman regarded me blankly through the sealed glass door. "You're Elise Cadwell," I yelled, not caring if she couldn't hear. Oh, Elsie. It's been Elsie this whole time. Oops. "You're Elsie Caldwell," I yelled, not caring if she couldn't hear. Elsie is a diminutive for both Elizabeth, which I'd known, and Alice, which I'd forgotten. I'd found out later that Gilman was her maiden name. She turned away from me. I pounded on the glass with my fists. She didn't respond, just climbed down the platform and out of sight. "I named it the instrument," her voice said. I couldn't see her, but her words resonated through the solid rock, as clear as if she whispered beside me. I think you'd call it a time machine. If you want to survive, you'll grab that handle. I'm going to pull the lever now. The chamber went utterly silent. No vibration, no noise, perfectly still air. I grasped the handle with both hands. I couldn't hear a thing, but I guess she pulled that lever. I became a cloud of atoms rushing through a tunnel of stone and spirit until I landed with a sigh. Chapter 10, December 2nd, 1889. There have been great moments now and then when a few people are gathered together and their thought becomes electrical and their minds mingle, as you have seen the glances of eyes mingle in a language more eloquent than speech. We ourselves have such moments, but the difference is they appreciate the value of them and hold them fast, while we open our hands and let them fly away like uncoveted birds or worthless butterflies. Unveiling a Parallel, Alice Jones and E. Merchant, 1893. When I returned to myself, I lay on the floor of the chambers, my limbs numb and near useless. The machine was still churning, emitting irregular banging sounds like a pair of shoes in a tumble dryer. Eventually, the noise became less frequent until there was a final clatter of metal on metal and a resigned wheeze of steam, and then the room was silent. The chamber door was unsealed. I clumsily fumbled it open and dragged myself out. The upper platform was intact and smelled of fresh wood. Small kerosene lamps lit the cavern, but they were flickering, low on fuel. I descended the platform mostly by crawling. I fell the last few feet off the ladder and landed in a painful heap. I was lucky not to twist an ankle. Feeling was coming back in my extremities along with a powerful thirst. The machine gleamed with so much shiny brass and copper that the cavern was saturated by a warm gold glow. It was brand new, which meant I was really here when this strange instrument was born. By the eastern tunnel, a dead man was slumped against the wall. His face was framed by overgrown brown mutton chops that were tinged with gray and small silver glasses, and he was dressed in a simple wool vest, collared shirt, and trousers. I assumed this was Ignatius Cadwell. I was able to stand now barely, and I made my way across the cavern like a toddler, grabbing at objects hand over hand for stability. Next to Cadwell's body lay a bucket, a tin cup, and, crucially, a journal. I'd seen the dead, but only at funerals. I didn't like to examine him, but I didn't see any obvious injury. November unknown, 1889. It seems that no one is coming. Elise, I'm going to pronounce it right now. Elsie left 4 days ago. I could no longer speak from shouting, and pounding on solid rock is a pointless waste of energy. Now I simply wait and reflect. We had been quarreling for days, but I admit I did not see it as more than the usual harping of a jealous wife. She convinced me that it was unfair for only me to use the instrument now that it was perfected. She accused me of diminishing her. I told her, "Do we celebrate the carpenter as we do the architect?" Perhaps that was unwise. I went forward those 4 mornings ago for my usual survey of the new Eden. When I returned, she was in a strange temper. She grabbed hold of me with unusual passion and apologized for her recent behavior, and then begged me to let her go one more time. Because I am a kind and generous husband, I agreed. That was foolish, and I wonder now whether those trips had caused some kind of mental derangement. Certainly there is nothing else to account for her recent turn. When I pulled the lever, she dissipated as usual, but then followed a distant explosion. Dirt wafted through the tunnels, choking the air in here. When I attempted to investigate, I discovered that the tunnels were blocked by debris. Within an hour, tendrils of smoke were curling in the chamber, and I realized the great hall must be aflame. I do not know the extent of the damage above me. Perhaps the entire community is in ashes.
I made some headway in clearing the eastern tunnel, but not enough. I am too exhausted to carry on.
Then that is where I will start digging.
Elsie prepared well and left almost nothing behind that would have been a useful tool. She left a supply of water, so I suppose to convince herself that she gave me a fair chance. It is long gone now. There is still hope of rescue, but it must be soon. I recognized the handwriting on that note.
Lynn? I called out. A weak reply from far off.
In here. I kicked rocks and boards aside and squeezed my way through the barely passable eastern tunnel, emerging in a root cellar, flanked on one side by a trough full of sand and a wooden storage crates on the other. The storage room ended in a staircase leading to a closed door. The cellar was lit by a flickering glass lantern and a tantalizing rectangle of sunlight around the doorframe. A man I presumed was Professor Jeffrey Lynn lay at the top of the stairs. He looked much more like a college professor than I did, with a Santa Claus beard and a crumpled bow tie. His wild expression suggested he thought I was a hallucination. "My name's Abby Fuller," I said. I'm your substitute teacher." He barked a laugh and struggled to sit up. "Does my substitute teacher have any water?" His voice was in tatters. I didn't do that in tatters. "Does my substitute teacher have any water?" His voice was in tatters, which I can appreciate. "Not yet," I pointed at the door. "May I?" He nodded and slid over to accommodate me at the top of the steps. The knob turned freely, but the door didn't budge. "I think it's barricaded on the other side," Lynn said. "I spent a day, maybe more, just getting through the tunnel. I was just too tired to..." "I'm not tired," I lied. I pushed harder. I slammed into the door with my shoulder. A scorched metal bar had been braced up against it. It clattered to the floor, and the cellar door popped open into the ruin of a pantry. The air stank of burnt wood and melted rubber. The sandstone walls had survived the worst of it, but everything else was singed or powdered in soot. Sunlight streamed down through the collapsed ceiling, and all the windows were empty of glass. I could see through to more broken rooms, arranged around a central space littered with the remains of the roof. The peak of the Astrolith was just visible among blackened beams and scorched furniture. I was inside the ruin of the Great Hall. I'd seen the Dean's painting, but it did not adequately convey the scale of this place. The hall had been an embodiment of their community, a massive building, even by modern standards, all built by hand. "Ah, yes, finally, the phalanstery," Lynn said sourly. He arrived too late to see it, even with a time machine. He tried to stand, but couldn't, and rested against the lintel. "I'll find some water," I said. In the bright sunlight, I could see how archaically he was dressed, with a simple vest, pocket watch, and wool pants. "It was to be my first time through," he said, his voice a whisper. "But I saw her face as she threw the lever. She had no intention of bringing me back." I nodded grimly. "I'll have to avoid being seen, but I'll return soon, I promise." It was a bright, cloudless December day with frost in the air. Without the Astrolith as a reference, I'd have never recognized where I was. The solemn brick edifices of the college were absent, and the trees were few and small. Instead of a tidy green lawn, the ground was covered in a patchwork of dirt, clover, and crabgrass. The odor of horses and hay was noticeable. Cadwell described our future as quiet, but I suppose it's what you're used to. To him, the laughter of crows, the sighs and shuffling of farm animals, the sound of a slow wagon crunching over gravel was the modern cacophony of life he sought to escape. What I heard most was an absence. No drone of distant airplanes, hum of ventilation systems, or trucks idling sloppily. In place of the college gymnasium was a large vegetable garden, shaded by a few gnarled pear trees and bordered on one end by a tiny hedge. A woman in a plain white cap was pulling up greenish pumpkins from a mass of vines. She looked otherwise alone, potentially safe to approach. I could also hear men's voices, many of them from a nearby barn. I don't want to rush into the barn. That seems ill-advised. "Hello?" I said cautiously. I smiled and held out my hands, palms up. "Hello," she said. She eyed my clothes, lingering on my jeans, but said nothing more. "Do you know where I could get some water?" "Oh, there's no more running water since the philanthropy burned. There's a cistern there," she said, nodding towards the row of stone houses. "Here, take this," and emptied tongue twister, and emptied a pail of pears into her basket of pumpkins. I hadn't noticed them behind the hedges. There were 8 now. That's the houses, not the pears. I leaned into the garden and took the pail from her gratefully. She was at least a head shorter than me. Tendrils of her blonde hair poked out from beneath the cap, and up close I could see that her neck was deeply scarred. Remnants of some infection I almost certainly had never needed to worry about. She was inspecting me in turn, which was only fair. She asked, "Which community are you from which allows for such reformed attire?" "Blythedale Farms?" I improvised. Please excuse me, I need to bring this to my friend urgently." My own thirst was now overwhelming. She nodded, disappointment. "If you want my advice, you'll leave as soon as you can," she said in a low voice. "This is no longer a place for women." I started to ask why, but she stopped suddenly, listening. She then crouched, pointing at the hedgerow. "Make yourself scarce." I did as she bid me, and heard the voices of men pass on the other side of the hedge. The first voice. "We can debate philosophy all day, and you know that you will, Owen." Try that again. "We can debate philosophy all day, and I know that you will, Owen. That does not change the fact that the bank is foreclosing on this land any day now. I intend to take back what I put into this foolhardy experiment." The reply, presumably from the man named Owen. "Then let us accept the offer from the ladies to incorporate at the community school. They have raised over $50,000 from various benefactors in Albany and Boston. That should be more than sufficient to recoup your investments." There was a braying and ugly laugh from a third voice. "A college for women will just breed more crones like Cadwells." "What concern is that of yours?" Owen said. "Let them carp and heckle each other to death. Your wife has no such flaw." The other man barked a laugh again. "This all sounds settled to me," Owen concluded. "Tomorrow we will go down to the village and send word to the bank." The voices faded, and I caught the eye of the woman. She nodded towards the houses, and I dashed across, wishing I could thank her better. A young girl in a neat green dress, about 6 years old, and a boy of the same age were playing in the dirt behind what I recognized as the Adams house. When they saw me, they stopped what they were doing, but said nothing. The cistern was a circular stone hole, roughly mortared inside, next to the largest of the houses. A lead pipe ran down the length of the house and disappeared into the hole. I couldn't see any water inside, but there was a rope with a hook affixed nearby. In my time, this house was a squash court. I put the hook over the handle on my pail and lowered it hand over hand while the girl watched. I felt it hit the surface of the water and could tell that it just flopped over and floated. The lightweight tin wasn't heavy enough. I moaned with frustration and pulled it back up again. The girl touched my arm, and I saw she held a heavy, smooth stone. For one wild moment, I thought she meant to hit me with it. But when she held it out, I understood. I dropped the stone in the bucket and lowered it again. This time I heard the satisfying plunk as the pail sunk below the water. Once full, it was surprisingly heavy. The girl, who had said not a word, reached down and pulled with me. The boy just watched from afar. "Thank you," I said to her, and gratefully drank straight from the pail. Together we refilled it, and then I began to return to the great hall by following a winding gravel road. She trotted along beside me, the boy forgotten. "What's your name?" I said. "Lily?" "I know a young woman named Lillian," I said. "You remind me a little of her." The sound of men's voices carried over the fields, and the girl grabbed my arm. "Come this way," she said. She pulled me into a narrow one-story clapboard building, long and low like a stable, painted white with black trim. The interior was effectively a single room, a long communal kitchen. A dozen women, most dressed in loose pants under skirts, moved between the 2 stone hearths and several massive work tables. There were stations for bread and stations for soup and large cabinets of white plates. I didn't see any meat. Most women were bareheaded, and their hair tied back in loose buns. I stopped short at the entrance, and they slowly began to notice me, pausing their work to just stare. "Through here," Lily urged. I weaved between the women, muttering apologies. The girl led me out a wide barn-like doorway where a few horses and wagons were tied, and then immediately into another large communal building. "This is the children's hall where we live," she explained. Like my faculty residence, it was made up of many individual bedrooms, but each was filled with cots and cradles. "You don't live with your parents?" I asked. She looked at me with honest puzzlement. "What are those?" Okay, we are getting close to time, but I'm going to press through this for one more chapter, at least to see what happens. Take a water break first. In character. Chapter 11. Then, despite all entreaties and expostulations and even threats, which the men at some point vainly tried, the women, everyone departed, and after a few days, in all the great Atlantic seaboard, from the pine forests of Maine to the wave-washed Florida Keys, there was not a woman to be seen. A Divided Republic, Lily Lake, 1887. Lynn was where I'd left him, and he was so grateful for the water that it took him a while to notice the girl. She was shy now and refused to get close to us. Instead, she kicked over debris in the ruin of the main atrium and clambered over around the Astrolith. I asked her who her parents were, but she didn't understand the question. "They raised their children communally," he said. He looked better already, though still frail. "So I gathered, but still, shouldn't she—" "They practiced eugenics," he said. "Or maybe it would be better to call it selective breeding. Women were encouraged, I guess they'd say, to take sexual partners assigned by the community for the purposes of producing superior children. The children were to be raised by the group without particular attachment to any one adult. They called the whole arrangement scientific marriage." Lynn seemed like a good person, but the euphemism grated on me. My face twisted in revulsion. "I don't suppose that bit of trivia appears in the Blythedale brochure." "Most of our deans have found aspects of the history inconvenient," he acknowledged. "Scientific marriage wasn't part of the original charter of the community. After a few years, they were struggling to attract men who were young and actually able to do physical work. Eugenics was fashionable at the time. I think they thought this would buy them a better class of utopians." "Buy or breed," I said. I watched the girl for a long moment. "She's Cadwell's daughter, you know." "Good Lord. Are you sure?" "She told me Cadwell is her surname, though she doesn't understand what it represents." "So she's also—" "I don't believe Alice would leave her own daughter." I paused. "If she was forced to endure her husband having children with other women, it may explain why she—" Lynn raised his voice. "So you think it's okay for her to have just left her husband to die in a fire trap? To banish us here? I gave the woman a job, a total stranger with no credentials." I shrugged, unwilling to argue over a point I was hardly sure of myself. "Do you know how to work the device?" I think so, assuming it's still intact. It doesn't have much in the way of controls. There's no dial with the year 1998 on it. You go forward if you're back, or back if you're forward. Each trip lands you a little further ahead in time. Cadwell never really understood how the thing worked." He sighed. "I suppose it really was Alice's invention after all." I was still looking at the girl. "Lillian Horace, your student, said her great-grandmother was one of the earliest graduates, and that she's named after her." "Yeah," he said, finally getting to his feet. "I was wondering the same thing. Abby, listen, even if I get it working—" "The machine requires someone to operate it," he nodded. "The Cadwells would agree on an elapsed time when he would re-enter the machine and she would pull the lever again to return him." "But it's not going to hold together that long." "We can try, but I think one of us has to stay." I told Lynn I'd follow him down in a minute. Once he was gone, the girl quietly stole into the room and stood beside me. She peeked into the darkness of the cellar while I found a shell of a tall cupboard. "Help me move this," I said. Together, we dragged it across the floor and slid it in front of the tunnel entrance, leaving just enough space for an adult to squeeze past. "Lily, this is very important. Are you listening?" She nodded. "Very soon, either I or Mr. Lin are going to come back through that door. But if for some reason neither of us does, after 1 hour, you need to push this cupboard as hard as you can. Nobody else can know about this entrance, and you can't follow me. Do you understand?" She nodded again. I was anxious to get to the machine, but, "Lily, do you know if you're going to stay here in Harmonia? Miss Adams said I might go live with her and my friend Saul." I assumed this was the boy with whom she was playing. "Do you like Miss Adams? Is she kind?" She shrugged. Raised communally, one adult was probably the same to her as any other. I got down to her at eye level. "Well, it was very nice to meet you, Miss Lily. If I don't see you again, take care of yourself." She looked down shyly. "Yes, ma'am." Then I left her. Lynn reported that the machine was in worse shape than he'd hoped. "They didn't exactly build this to last," he said. I'll do my best, but I didn't know how to help him, so I decided the best thing I could do was to give Cadwell a semblance of a burial. Though, if I'm being honest, it was mostly so I didn't have to look at him. One of the collapsed tunnels had been lined with bricks, and they had spilled out into the cavern. I used them to make a crude cairn. I remembered that Lynn remarked on the burial in his journal. He assumed Alice had made it. The idea made my head spin. The iron stone still had plenty of coal. Lynn had only to ignite it and stoke it until, quote, the steam chamber reached full pressurization. This meant some waiting around and then a lot of winding of spools and rotating of gears. There was an array of gauges along the device, and he spent yet more time adjusting things until he was satisfied with their readouts. He stroked his beard thoughtfully and looked over the contraption. "I think it's ready." "I think it's ready," he yelled over the din. "For you?" I had to get close to him to shout back, "No, this is Abby. I want to stay. I've been studying these communities my entire life. It's like the ultimate field trip." He sounded brave, but not entirely convincing. "No, you go, and I'll follow. I'll get someone else to operate it. Maybe the girl Lily can." Lynn started to argue and then ducked as a rivet came shooting out of the machine like a bullet. "There's not going to be another chance. This thing is flying apart at the seams." On cue, the device let out a percussive polyphonic bang, a sound like a dozen cars backfiring. "Okay, fine." I had to lean into his ear to be heard. I came up with a quick plan on the spot. "Jeffrey, wait, I don't remember what to do when I'm in the chamber. You just need to... Can you show me?" "Sure," he said agreeably. Together, we climbed up to the top platform, and he stepped through the threshold of the chamber. "You just need to put both feet on the metal plate here and hold on to the handle both hands to be safe." I put my hand on the chamber door. I'm going to click on platform, excuse me. It was shuddering so violently at this point, I thought neither of us would be going back. I put my hand on the chamber door. All I needed to do was close and lock it, as Alice had done. One of us was going back, and I just had to decide whether it was him or me. Oh boy, we're now at the Vault of Heaven choice, perhaps at the end. Really, honestly, I think that I'm gonna say me. Let's go back. My hand lingered on the door for another moment and then fell. I'd like to believe I was just respecting his wishes, but honestly, I just wanted to go home. "That makes sense. Thanks," I said inanely. He frowned in suspicion. "Go ahead. There's no more time." We traded places, but I left my hand propping open the door. "You don't have to do this." "This is what I want." He closed and sealed the chamber door. I cupped my hands over my face and hollered into the glass, "Take care of the girl." I don't know if he heard. A moment later, he pulled the giant lever, and I was blown apart. May 28th, 1999. Up here in western Massachusetts, spring lasts about a day, but can be utterly glorious, neither cold nor humid, sometimes not even raining. Today is one of those days, the perfect weather coupled with the effervescent mania of students who've just finished exams. Sadly, I have to grade them. In spite of the workload, I'm giddy too. I've been informed I'll be back next year as a real assistant professor. I can stop correcting the girls who call me prof. I'm grading at a picnic table near the crest of the foothill. From here I can see the full expanse of the campus and down into the valley, the ghostly outlines of the utopians' fences and foundations made visible. In my mind's eye I can easily fill them in, with golden crops and slow horses and grand optimistic halls. Abby, a voice says behind me, and I get chills. Alice Gilman is regarding me in that curious way she has. I have not seen her since autumn. When I returned home through her machine, she was no longer in the cavern. In her place was Lillian, staring around the room with open-mouthed astonishment until I yelled at her to help me down. The ladders had completely collapsed and the cavern was filling with black coal smoke. I ran into the main lever and pulled, hoping he had been able to follow me through, but the machine did nothing and I could barely breathe. We fled together with little time to spare before the room became a furnace. The next morning, on schedule and in spite of a small but noisy band of student protesters, the bulldozers went to work on removing what they believed to be a moderately sized meteorite. An hour into the proceeding, which obviously could not have succeeded in any case, a backhoe tipped forward into an unexpected and massive sinkhole. There were no injuries, but a round robin of blame ensued among the surveyors, architects, and construction workers. The Science Center extension was postponed, maybe for good. Lillian, Ella, and I have checked several times. The underground tunnels were all obliterated by the collapse of the cavern. They're now just forgotten crawl spaces that lead nowhere. Up in the quad, the sinkhole was filled with dirt and sod rolled over in its place. Alice Gilman vanished from campus and was not missed. Here, she says now, without preamble. She hands me a yellowed envelope. In a very neat hand with faded ink, it reads, "To Abigail Fuller." I do not recognize the writing. It was found in the college archive about 5 days ago. I did not know the person it was addressed to until the night you arrived when you told me your name. She stops. For so long, I think she isn't going to continue. They did not believe I was fit to breed their children, but I still cared for her, even though she wasn't mine. After I read this, I knew she could have people who would... After I read this, I knew she could have people who would love her if I sent them back. I could have died, I say, but I'm not even angry anymore. I didn't die, and Lynn said it was what he wanted. I've chosen to believe him. Yes, she acknowledges. She looks like she's about to leave. We both know I have no ability to stop her, and then says, I thought after 100 years I would find my place, but this is a loud and fearful world, and I do not much like it either. I'm truly sorry they treated you badly, I find myself saying. She nods just a bit. I know it is easy to laugh at us, at our ridiculous and idealistic experiments. I laughed at my husband once I stopped fearing him. Yet, we shaped a society with our own hands as we wished it to be. For a time, it was a fair place, better than most. We dreamed of a new Eden, and I built a true wonder. You take only such small steps. Without waiting for my response, she turns and descends along the hillside. I look down at the letter in my hands and then read it. May 5th, 1919. Dear Miss Fuller, I hope you remember me after all this time. Uncle Jeffrey assured me that you will, no matter how long I wait, but that I should not write until I have something to say. I don't know if this news merits a letter, but I dare not wait much longer. I would not want you to be so old that you've forgotten me. I'm grateful for our chance meeting. I would have had a very different life had you and Uncle not arrived at our community. I know he is not my real uncle, but that is what I shall call him. If not for you... Why, who's writing this? I'm going to keep reading. Okay. Sorry. Confused. If not for you, I would have not been able to stay here and attend what is now Blythedale College. Oh, wait. This is a girl writing this. Okay. Rereading it from the top. From the top. Dear Miss Fuller, I hope that you remember me after all this time. Uncle Jeffrey assumed me that you will, no matter how long I wait, but that I should not write until I should not write until I have something to say. I don't know if this news merits a letter, but I dare not wait much longer. I would not want you to be so old that you've forgotten me. I'm grateful for our chance meeting. I would have had a very different life had you and Uncle not arrived at our community. I know he is not my real uncle, but that is what I call him. If not for you, I would not have been able to stay here and attend what is now Blythedale College. It is likely I would have attended no college at all. If it is one thing my unconventional upbringing has taught me, it is the importance of education. Uncle was adamant that I be part of the first graduating class. You should know he has passed on. I was only a few years out of school and newly married. I stayed here to teach the next generation of girls. When I came of age, he left saying, there is so much here I need to see for myself. He made it all the way to Wyoming. Can you imagine? It has been years, but I still miss him. His knowledge of the world seemed boundless. He asked me to tell you that he'd fulfilled your request. He assured me you knew what that meant. As such, I have no other family with whom to share my latest news. We have had our first child. It's a girl, and I've named her Abigail. I do not know to what address I should post this letter, but Uncle had told me, with that familiar twinkle in his eyes, to simply keep it safe and eventually you would read it. I don't see how this can be true, but as I said, he comprehended so many mysteries. Yours, Lillian Cadwell Noyes. P.S. I hope that you are able to come and see my daughter sometime. She is so beautiful, and it would gladden my heart to show you the woman that I have become. And a final pencil sketch of the quad. Credits? Sure, we'll read them. Story and programming by Liza Daly. Oh, link to website, lizadaly.com, everybody. I'll stop clicking on those. Hand-drawn illustrations and cover by Shamus, perhaps, Hefferman. Decorative ornaments by the Walden Font Company. Thank you to Dan Schmidt and Stephen Grenade for story feedback and testing. I owe a debt to Paradise Now, the story of American utopianism by Chris Jennings, a hugely entertaining account of 5 19th century utopian experiments. Bibliography continues here. Interestingly, all the quotes from the heading the chapters were from real works. I did recognize at least a couple of the authors' names. Louisa May Alcott, yes, I've heard of her. The Harmonia's newspaper is based on the Harbinger, produced at Brook Farm, and the Circular, produced by the Oneida community. Some of the newspaper text in the story is taken near verbatim from the Circular. And that is the end of Harmonia. Copyright 2017, Liza Daly. Okay, that was a long read. That's it. I have nothing more to say on this topic. Thank you to Liza for making a fantastic game. I'm very glad I did this, and I'm going to go rest my voice for a while. I hope anyone who has stuck through this whole listening, either live or later on the YouTubes, enjoyed yourselves. I am Jason McIntosh. You can find me at jmac.org. I am also jmac.org spelled out on the Twitters. My namesake Jason Dyer just showed up in the chat. Hi. He's at bluerenga.com. He plays a lot of adventure games. He has nothing to do with any of this, but he's a cool dude. I'm a little giddy for having finished this. That's it. He asks, have I finished Hadean? No. Hadean Lands, we're still playing every Sunday until we're done. We're doing part 9 at 6 p.m. Eastern on Sunday, February mumbleth, whenever that is. February 13th is the next part of that. Yeah, and you can see all the recordings of Hadean Lands so far and other interactive fiction games I've been streaming like this at this YouTube channel, which is also available at jmac.org/TV. And that gives you a channel you can subscribe to if you wish to get notified of new episodes and stuff. And I am done with this. So thanks for joining me, everybody. And talk to you later. Good night. Play some more cool games. Don't step into any time machines unless you really want to. And if you do, I will believe that was your actual wish. Okay, good night.